My name is Arthur Conquest. I'm a resident here in Brookline, and I'm the de facto chair of the forum, Mass Incarceration and Racial Inequality, and I'm also a member of the Mass Occupy Brookline group that's sponsoring this. I'd like to welcome everybody to the main branch of the Brookline Public Library. I'd also like to thank the trustees of the library, as well as the staff, especially Chuck Flaherty, a fellow runner who's trying to keep up with me at my age, for their support and cooperation that they've given in producing this endeavor. This evening could not be possible without the hard work and attention from the following individuals. And I'd like them to each stand when I call their names so they can be recognized for their efforts. Trish Connors, who I see walking out, can you just stay right there? Kea Van der Ziel, Frank Farlow, Susan Chipman, Abraham Chipman, Bobby Nagel, Lee Cook Childs, Bruce Wolfe, Ed Legler, Cruz Sanabria, and David Clafter, who's sitting up here, who will be the moderator. I'd also like to recognize the co-sponsors of this evening's forum, the League of Women Voters, Brookline PACS, and I hope I have this right, the Northeast Region chapter of the American Friends Services Committee. Is that right?
Yes.
Thank you. Bathrooms or restrooms are right outside in the corridor. Please keep in mind that we must vacate the library no later than 8:30, and that's very, very important. I just want to add my 2 cents, and I know that I'm going to overstep my bounds, but I'll do it very quickly. But I read this statement, and I have to share it with you this evening. And I apologize for taking the extra 2 minutes in doing this. And quote, as the New York City Police Commissioner, Bernard Kirk was ultimately responsible for incarceration of many criminals. Now that he has seen the prison system from inside, having served 3 years behind bars, he has a new appraisal of the U.S. penal system. Insane. In his first interview since his release from prison, where he served time for tax evasion and lying to federal authorities, Kirk told NBC's Matt Lauer on the Today Show, quote, "No one in the history of our country has ever been in the system with my background. You have to be on the other side of the bars. You have to see what it's like to be a victim of the system. There's no way to do that from the other side. If the American people and members of Congress saw what I saw, there would be anger, there would be outrage, there would be change, because nobody would stand for it." Kirk's main grief is with mandatory minimum sentencing. He served his time with non-violent inmates, many of them first-time offenders who received disproportionate sentences for their crimes. Kirk handed Lauer a nickel during his interview to demonstrate the amount of cocaine that sends an offender to jail. It was with men sentenced to 10 years in prison for 5 grams of cocaine, he said. That's insane. That's insane. He went on to say, anybody that thinks we can take these young black men out of Baltimore and D.C. and give them a 10-year sentence for 5 grams of cocaine and then believe that they're going to return to society a better person in 10 years from now, when you give them no life improvement skills, when you give them no real rehabilitation, this is not benefiting society. Mandatory sentences do not discourage criminal behavior, but rather set up inmates for failure, Kirk maintained. The system is supposed to help them, not destroy them. Our moderator this evening, again, as I mentioned, is David Clafter, a longtime activist fighting for social justice, a Brookline resident for many years, and a town meeting member from Precinct 12. Here's David, and I hope you enjoy and gain something from this evening's program. Thank you.
Thank you. I've been particularly interested in prisons since the early 1970s, when the state of Illinois put me in one of their penitentiaries for a year for what they considered overly enthusiastic opposition to the war in Vietnam. I thought I had a pretty good understanding of the American criminal justice system until I first heard Michelle Alexander speak. I came to realize that what I had experienced back then had since been transformed. Almost 5 times as many people are now incarcerated. The state now controls, either in prisons and jails or through parole and probation, 3.2% of the adult population. Many urban minority communities have seen 30% or more of their young males incarcerated. The U.S. imprisons vastly more than any other country in the world. The rest of the world, on average, imprisons at a rate of 1/6 that of the U.S. If we care at all about social justice, this is an issue we have to face. Tonight we have 3 speakers who have all spent many years in the trenches of this battle. We will hear from each of them, give them a short period to respond to each other, and then open the floor for questions. At the end of the program, we'll tell you a number of ways you can get involved and various upcoming events. Our first speaker is Carl Williams. Carl was born in 1969 in Rhode Island. He graduated from the University of Rhode Island in 1991 and the University of Wisconsin Law School in 2006. He joined the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union of Massachusetts, as a staff attorney in this past September after serving as a criminal defense attorney with the Roxbury Defenders Unit of the Committee for Public Counsel Services. A longtime resident of the Roxbury neighborhood, he's been an activist and organizer on issues of war, immigrants' rights, LGBT rights, racial justice, and Palestinian self-determination. He's a member of the National Lawyers Guild and served on its Massachusetts Board of Directors. During the Occupy Boston movement, he was part of its legal defense and support team, which provided nearly 24-hour-a-day support to the participants. More recently, Carl was a Givelberg Distinguished Lecturer on Public Interest Law at Northeastern University Law School, where he taught a class on social justice movements and the law. And Carl's going to give us an overview of really the implications of Michelle Alexander's book from a legal perspective.
And I'm going to give people notice when we get 3 minutes left.
Thank you very much for that introduction. That sounds very fancy, but I like to think there's like the grassroots. I like to feel like I'm the dirt. And so more than anything, I'm a lawyer. Sometimes I walk around in a suit, but I live in Roxbury, and I think for a long time I was blessed to represent people in my neighborhood. And one of the things that made me really proud was walking through Dudley Square, walking through Mission Hill, and someone was saying, "That's the lawyer that represented someone's brother." and feeling that I could stand in court shoulder to shoulder with a brother or sister of mine and defend them against what is a horrible, unjust system. And that thing, I think, is the introduction to what I really want to talk about in sort of framing the battle that we're fighting. So I'm going to ask, I actually taught a class at Northeastern University Law School just a year ago called Crash the System, which was based on actually an op-ed that Michelle Alexander wrote in the New York Times about trying to bring a specific tactic she was suggesting to attack the criminal justice system, the mass incarceration system in the United States. And in that class, I asked a trick question. So I'm going to ask you this trick question. And I'll warn you that at the beginning, it's a trick question. How many people think that the criminal justice system in the United States is broken? They're afraid to raise their hands. And I'm going to say, and it might surprise you, it isn't broken. It's not broken. Because if we say it's broken, we have to go back and say, okay, there was a day, there was a time, maybe a span of time, over which it became broken. And that seems to happen, maybe someone did that on purpose, someone came in and threw a wrench in it and broke it, or it sort of just veered off course. And if we think of that, when did that happen? Was it the 2000s? Was it the 90s? Was it sometime in the 80s when maybe Reagan announced the drug war? Was it good in the 70s? Was it better sometime in the 60s? Was it 100 years ago? What I'm here to say is, it isn't broken. It's fixed. It's rigged. It's set up to work a certain way. It's set up to control a certain set of people. And now I feel bad because I made all you raise your hands and you're like, Jack, I raised my hand. But I think you were the brave ones. You were the brave ones. Because you said what you thought. Some people, there might be one or two people who thought it, but didn't want to raise their hands because I said it was a trick. But if we think of it that it is not broken, right? Because I think if we think of it as broken, then it seems that we can just take some fact and present that fact to some person and say, hey, look, this system is kind of unjust, a little bit, you know, and maybe we could just turn the dial back and sort of make it better. And if we think that way, we're trying to attack something in a strategic way that will never fix the problem. It will never fix the problem. Because the people who want the system this way, here's another trick question, which don't raise your hand for this, because it's not the answer you think. I just lost my train of thought. But the war on drugs. Sometimes in the media, you'll get some sort of quasi-liberal story, and they'll say, the war on drugs has failed. So the trick question is, has the war on drugs failed? Some people don't. No, it's just that the other side is winning. There are people who think, and there actually was a study done from the Kennedy School at Harvard, which has been bastardized and misread and misunderstood, but very frequently the Boston Police Department, very frequently police officers, and very frequently people who are sort of on the other side of this issue from us say 96% of the violent crime that occurs in the city is caused by 2% of the population. That is not true. That is incredible misreading of that report. What the report really says is, in a certain age group, a certain set of violent crimes in certain geographic areas are committed by, about 90% of those are committed by 2% of the population, if you sort of corral it into this very specific group. But the mindset is, there's 2% of the population out there, and you can guess who, those folks in power who believe this other ideology, believe who that is. And they believe if we can just get those people locked up enough, on GPS enough, stuck in their house under house arrest, probation, parole, or executed enough, if we can just get that set of people under enough control, you know, chained in an isolation unit in they call it SHU, but in a solitary confinement for 23, 24 hours a day, if we can get that population totally controlled, oh, then it'll just be paradise. The world will be a good place. And that is the other mindset. That's the other mindset that we're battling. And I think if we look at that, that this system is fixed. The system is created to control a certain set of the population. And when we run the analogy, and Michelle Alexander does it, she does it to Jim Crow. I'm going to take a step back in history and compare it to slavery. If we compare it to slavery, a lot of us are the great-great-great-grandchildren of this, a lot of the folks who are incarcerated today are the great-great-great-grandchildren of people who are in chains. And I like to think it's the same chains. They're just in a different place. And if we look at it that way, one of the things I think we butt our heads against a lot when we do this work is people say, but there's a public safety thing, but there's a lot of crime. This is not a paradigm. It's just as much a false paradigm with it, where people say, well, we want civil liberties and we want freedom. Oh, but we want security and there's a danger of terrorism. Those things are not on the same continuum, right? It isn't we have one or the other. In the same way, when people say, well, we need a strong criminal justice system, we need to give the police certain powers, we need to, the thing that the police are doing is actually looking away from crime, right? If you look at the numbers in New York on stop and frisk, if maybe the two of us were like, okay, we're gonna be super police and we're gonna go out and we're gonna just not pay any attention to the Fourth Amendment, and we're just gonna search what we wanna search, we're gonna stop what we wanna stop, and we're gonna try to arrest as many people committing crimes. Without making up crimes, we're gonna try to arrest as many people. In New York, it's almost twice as likely that a person stopped by a New York police officer in their stop and frisk program, it's almost twice as likely that a white person is carrying some type of contraband than a person of color is. I'm going to say that slower and again. It is almost twice as likely that a white person is carrying a white person stopped under the stop and frisk programs of New York. It's almost twice as likely that that person is carrying contraband than a person of color is. So when people say, well, they're just aggressively pursuing crime. No, they're not. What they're really doing is they're looking in this corner and they're trying to find crime, and they're on average stopping about 100 to 150 black and brown folks before they're getting some type of felony or misdemeanor arrest. And if you want to think of that as an image, there's a whole bunch of other people running by committing all kinds of crimes that the police are not looking at. And one just dramatic example I give of that, if you'll excuse me for going outside of New York for a moment, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Jeffrey Dahmer when he was out, he was actually on probation when this happened. A Vietnamese boy, he was 14 years old, fled Jeffrey Dahmer's house, was on his front lawn, naked. A police officer saw this and said, that's strange. He was babbling, he seemed to be either have some mental health problem or under a lot of drugs. The police officer took him, knocked on the door, and escorted him back into Jeffrey Dahmer's house. And that, I just use that as a very dramatic example of the way the criminal justice system works, right? Because if that was Skip Gates, and he was opening, put those two things together. Skip Gates was opening his front door coming back from Logan Airport. That's a crime. Jeffrey Dahmer was murdering, raping, and eating human beings, and someone brought someone back to his house while he was on probation, right? A naked child on his front lawn. But I think that's a very dramatic example, but that's what happens. That type of thing is what happens when we have this system of control that's built to find black people, to find brown people, to find immigrants, to find poor people, and put them under lock and key, put them on probation, put them on parole, put them under GPS supervision. And I think one of the things that we do, and I know that I've done this, and I was a criminal defense attorney in my heart, I still am a criminal defense attorney, but one of the things I think we do is we say, well, that person did something bad. That person maybe did something violent to women. That person maybe sold drugs to children. But I'll say two things about that. One is, everyone has either committed a misdemeanor or felony in their life, or been in a situation where if they were another color, another race, in a different place in the hood, could have, would have, or might have been arrested for that, charged with that, faced with mandatory minimums, and then pled to something that they didn't want to plead to, because instead of getting 15 years, they might have said, well, I can get 18 months and I can get back to my family and it'll be okay. But there before the grace of God, that could have been any of it. Very easily could have been some of us, and it may have been some of us, I don't know. So I think when we look at the problems of public safety, if we didn't have this system of mass incarceration, this racist, just corralling black and brown and poor human beings into jails and prisons, if we didn't have that system, we would be able to address the other problem, which is a different problem. That there's violence in our communities, that there's poverty in our communities, that there's issues of gender-based violence in our communities. That would be a much easier problem to address if we weren't wasting so much energy, so much attention, and so much goddamn money on this other system of control, this racist system of control. So I think when we think of people, I think of sort of historic struggles quite a bit, and I say, how did people win, right? Because I think this is not a trick question. How insurmountable is this problem? Sometime in the last year, you thought about the problem and say, we can't win that. That's not a problem we can win. We can be realistic. No one thought that. In this country, slaves rose up against slavery. Slaves rose up against slavery, right? And then some people joined them. And then some people said, oh, that looks pretty bad. And then some people helped them flee. And then some people in the North said, oh, well, that's maybe not such the best thing in the world. And more people, and the Underground Railroad was set up. And then a number of things, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed. And some people said, well, this states' rights thing, we don't agree with that. And then the Supreme Court got involved. But that was because a whole bunch of other things happened. Regular people who were the voice of the oppressed came into the argument, right? And people started saying, we're not gonna do this anymore. And people won that battle. People won the battle against Jim Crow. People won the battle, the labor battles over the last 200 years. And those battles certainly were seemingly insurmountable at the time. But I think looking at that analogy to slavery, no one would ever, when working against, I bet you someone did say it, but it's never been recorded in history, that someone said, well, these slaves, some of them have been violent. Some of them have committed crimes. Maybe we could just teach them to read and then their lives would be better. Right? You think of that now, it seems crazy. But I think a lot of times with the problem, the mass incarceration system, some people say, well, maybe if we just taught them not to break the law. And maybe if we just got them some jobs. This is a system of control. You could have as many things, those things need to happen, but we need to have a systemic analysis that says the problem is not the problem in the communities. The problem is not the fact that illiteracy rates or education issues. The problem is, those are problems, but the problem is this mass incarceration system. And once the chains of that are removed, and they will be removed when we're victorious, once those chains are removed, the other problems are going to become so much easier to address, and we're going to feel so great, and folks who are oppressed from that are going to feel so great that we're going to have the ability to work all that much harder on these issues. And the last thing I just want to say is there are really two kinds of people who are incarcerated in the United States. And those are people who went to jail for overtly political reasons. And then people who were in jail because of political reasons. Right? They didn't have the luxury of that choice. So someone who's locked up and they say, I'm going to protest, or I'm going to go be part of OccupyBoston and be arrested, or I'm going to be part of some civil disobedience action at a nuclear power plant. And then there are people who just live a life that they're under the heel of this racialized, politicized oppression. So I think when we think of people, all of those people are victims. All of the people who have served time in this country should, because of the oppression that they receive in that sense, should be lionized. We should listen to their stories. We don't need to, if there was violence committed, we don't need to give voice to that, but we need to say that this person was punished, this person was hurt, this person was victimized by a racist system, and we, I think, I'll say me as a person of some privilege, needs to hear those stories, listen to those, and I think that's the bond that really needs to be made. We need to listen to people who have that really, to people who've been imprisoned, to people who've been incarcerated, hear those people's voices, and I think that emotional attachment makes it so that we can get up and continue the struggle. I hope to hear from some of you all and have a little bit more of a discussion, but thanks a lot.
Our next speaker is Lois Ahrens. Lois is the founder and director of the Real Cost of Prisons Project. She's been a social justice activist for more than 45 years. In 2000, she started the Real Cost of Prisons Project, which is a national organization that brings together activists, artists, justice policy researchers, and people who directly experience the impact of mass incarceration to more effectively work to end it. The project created workshops. It has a website that includes a section of writing and comics by prisoners. And they produced 3 comic books which deal with different aspects of the prison reality. More than 135,000 free comic books have been sent to prisoners and others. They're anthologized into the book, The Real Cost of Prisons Comics, which you can see on the table outside, and you're welcome to take one for a small donation of your choosing to the Real Cost of Prisons Project. Through her work, Lois has built an extensive network with prisoners. These relationships have informed and transformed the work, leading to a greater focus on extremely long sentences and the punitive and damaging conditions in prison today. In Massachusetts, her focus includes increasing parole, stopping new prison and jail construction, and most recently, ending the policy of dogs sniffing everyone visiting prisoners. She's dedicated to building a movement that will end the harmful and costly systems that drive mass criminalization. I think it's worth it to think for a minute about what it means to have dogs sniff you when you're coming to visit a loved one in jail. But that is the current reality. Lois is going to talk about mass incarceration in Massachusetts, and she is.
I agree with Carl that we have to hear people's voices that are incarcerated and have been incarcerated. And I hope if people go to the Real Cost of Prisons website, there's a section called Writing from Prison, Comics from Inside, which is just that, people's voices. I hope everybody takes a look at that. I'm going to focus most of my talk on Massachusetts, but I want to tell you first what I think is driving mass incarceration. First, political expediency and political opportunism. As we saw in the push for the 3 strikes law here in Massachusetts, which was initiated by the governor and supported overwhelmingly by the legislature, and in tens of thousands of other harsh and excessively punitive laws that have passed since the 1970s. To money. Mass incarceration, mass criminalization is a more than $210 billion industry built on caging people who in the past were needed as workers in factories that no longer exist, and for jobs either now outsourced or made unnecessary by technology. And it would not be possible to criminalize millions of people every year, the majority of whom are African American and Latino, if this system were not built on racism. In the last 40 years, the prison population has skyrocketed due to the war on drugs, which includes extreme policing, especially targeting African Americans in their neighborhoods and communities, like stop and frisk, driving or walking while black, long mandatory minimum sentences for drug convictions, which allow for no judicial discretion. And for all convictions, extremely long sentences. For example, the sentence of life without parole has increased 83% between 1992 and 2000, while violent crimes dropped for that period. And this is not because the crimes are any more severe. This is because of what's happened to the nature of, is that better?
Yeah.
Thank you. Nature of sentencing. In Massachusetts, currently 900 prisoners in the state are serving life without parole, 900 prisoners out of 12,000 prisoners. Mass incarceration has skyrocketed due to the increasing power of district attorneys and the huge increase in plea bargains and much higher bail and fewer people being released on their own recognizance. A couple of months ago, I was visiting a friend in Norfolk prison, and while I was waiting in the waiting room, I was talking to a woman, and she was visiting someone by the name of Ralph Ham, who some of you may know him or know about him. And she told me that Mr. Ham had coined the word Mississippi. And when I heard this word, I thought, yes, yes. And it turns out that originally I thought, well, this is kind of denigrating to Massachusetts. But when I look at what's going on in Massachusetts, and when I look at some of what's going on in Mississippi, in terms of reforming the worst of their solitary confinement, it's actually denigrating to Mississippi. So I want people, when they think of Massachusetts as an enlightened and progressive state, which I won't ask people to raise their hands, but I think when it comes to criminal justice, you need to think of Massachusetts as Alabama or Louisiana or Arkansas. One example, as I mentioned, is that in July 2012, Massachusetts passed a 3 strikes bill, overwhelmingly. The Senate and the House voted for it. Coakley wanted it, the governor wanted it, and it was passed, and we have it, it's law. The last state before Massachusetts to pass 3 strikes was Arizona in 2005. In November, as some of you know, California turned back some of the worst excesses of 3 strikes. But here in Massachusetts, what the new law is doing is it gives even more power to district attorneys to extract plea bargains from defendants who already have difficulties finding lawyers to defend them. Massachusetts still has no law that prevents the shackling of women prisoners when they're in labor and childbirth. People are shocked when they find out that this is going on, but this is going on. Women can be shackled in labor and childbirth, and the only time that they're not is if a healthcare provider intervenes at that point. And if there's no healthcare provider to intervene, then it can go on. Guards can opt to stay in the room during delivery. Women, when they're being moved from prison or jail to a hospital, are shackled and are set in the back of a car, shackled, being about to deliver, being handcuffed and shackled. This is happening in Massachusetts right now. 14 states ban it, but not Massachusetts. In Massachusetts and Arkansas are the only states that sentence people to solitary confinement for up to 10 years. In the United States, there are approximately 80,000 men and women in solitary, some for a few months and some for as long as 40 years. In Massachusetts, roughly 640 of state prisoners are in segregation units every day. This means that they're locked in a concrete box the size of a parking space for 23 hours a day, 7 days a week. African Americans and Hispanics make up 18% of the population in Massachusetts. They make up 52% of the prison population, and they make up 57% of the people in Supermax prison in Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, like everywhere, men and women are placed in solitary for disciplinary infractions, and most often because they have mental illness, which makes it difficult for them to follow the bazillion rules in prisons and jails. Every jail and every prison has solitary of some kind. I live in Northampton. The county south of me is Hampden County. In May, in Hampden County, at the jail for women there, which is in Chicopee, women who had been placed in segregation filed a class action suit against the sheriff, Michael Ash. And the reason that they did this was that male guards were videotaping them being strip searched which means that they were standing naked before a guard, male guard, lifting their breasts, spreading the cheeks of their buttocks, and bending over, while a male guard stands 8 feet away with a video camera, videotaping them. The women that were being taped were women going to segregation because of a disciplinary infraction or because they were on suicide watch. This is what they were doing to women going on suicide watch, or because they couldn't be in the general population because of their mental illness. So this is what they were doing. And a group of them filed a class action suit. So now Ash, in his infinite wisdom, has women guards doing this. Right? This is his accommodation to the suit. As you may know, Massachusetts has a corrections master plan. Maybe you don't know. It calls for building 3 new jails for women, another jail in Middlesex County, and 3 prisons for aging and dying prisoners at a cost for up to $2 billion. This is just the cost of building them, not running them. And that's for more than 10,000, what they say is beds, right? The majority of states in the country have something called compassionate release or medical parole, but not Massachusetts. So this is where an option for dying prisoners. But in Massachusetts now, the plan is to build separate prisons for them. To implement the first part of the corrections master plan, a $550 million bond was authorized in 2008. And building is happening now. This is going on now. This includes an even bigger jail for women in Chicopee, which is about to open in December. I called there the other day to find out how many women were there and what categories of women were locked up in the jail. And they told me that there were 110 women who were sentenced, convicted. And there were 55 women who were there in what they call awaiting trial, in the awaiting trial. And what awaiting trial is people that have not been convicted, people who are waiting to come to trial and cannot get out of prison because of bail. So there were 110 women sentenced, 55 awaiting trial. The expanded jail, the Chicopee jail, is being built with no public comment and no public discussion whatsoever. It's just like 1 minute it wasn't there, the next minute they were digging a hole in the ground. Hopefully, the same thing will not be true of a bill by Kay Kahn, which is bill number 1434. She is proposing a new jail just for women awaiting trial. That is, they're not convicted of anything. Kahn's office, when I called them to talk about it, I said, well, what about the new jail? They said, well, there is no jail. I said, well, here's the bill number. And he said, well, you mean the new facility? Right? It's not a jail, it's a facility. And it's a facility for women that haven't been convicted of anything. And that's going to be built in Middlesex County, unless people try to stop it. Women are 7% of the population. Women prisoners are 7% of the prison population. Yet they're 33% of all people awaiting trial. So this disproportionately falls on women. And that 33% doesn't even account for women in houses of correction or jail. These are just women in prison. The average length of stay for a woman awaiting trial is more than 2 months at a cost of more than $3,000 a month. More than 60% of the women are held only because they can't make bail, and that bail is less than $1,000. So this is the kind of trade-off. In Billerica, a new temporary jail is being built for men. This is being, built now, also without really any public discussion. And this is for an awaiting trial unit for men that were in Cambridge. That jail housed around 300 men, but the new jail, the temporary expanded jail, which is being built and costs $37 million, is for 496 men, right? A lot more than the 300. This is also called an expansion because it's next to the current jail, which is already an expanded jail. And another jail is being built in Middlesex County, the permanent jail. And I would bet anything that the temporary expanded $37 million jail is never going to close. It's just more jail space. Each year in Massachusetts, we spend more than $1.2 billion to keep 24,000 people in cages. That's more than the budget for public higher education. Of that $1.2 billion, 2% goes for education, drugs, alcohol program, and vocational training. So by looking at the budget, you can see where it is that the priorities of the DOC lie. While Massachusetts is building more prisons, which is happening right now, other states are going in the other direction. New York has closed 7 prisons since 2011, and more are being closed. From 2011 to 2012, at least 17 states closed prisons and reduced their prison populations, including New York, Texas, Florida, Illinois, which closed their supermax prison called TAMS, Connecticut, Colorado, and Kentucky. The reasons for this are a national decrease in crime, significant changes in other places in mandatory sentences for drug convictions, bail reform in other places, drug courts in other places, and graduated sanctions for parole violations. None of these is happening in Massachusetts, except that there was a slight change in mandatory sentences for people with drug convictions that offers the possibility of parole. But since about 1.5 years ago, when Deval Patrick fired the parole board and replaced them all with former DAs, there basically is no parole in Massachusetts. Now parole rate in Massachusetts is 26%. A couple of years ago it was 40%. In 1990, it was 69%. And this is not because of any greater horribleness on the part of people who are sentenced. This is because of a punitive construct that's going on and has gone on, which is what's driving this sense of punitiveness in Massachusetts and everywhere. I'm going to skip some of this stuff. In Massachusetts, African American and Latino women make up 35% of the prison population, and it's probably much higher than in the jails. People of color are 71% of people serving mandatory minimums for drug convictions, 71%. Even though Massachusetts decriminalized small amounts of marijuana possessions, African Americans are still arrested at 4 times the amount of whites, even with decriminalization, still being targeted. So, hopefully, you're asking yourself, why is Massachusetts so backward? And so I made a list in no special order of why I think Massachusetts is so backward. I mean, I'm sure there are people in the audience that can, chime in at the end. First, the unchallenged power of district attorneys and prosecutors, and the disproportionate financing of prosecutors, as opposed to the fraction of money going for indigent defense. The power and reverence of the police, and the power of police unions. No citizen review boards. The power of guards and guards unions. The power of the professional victim rights organizations, which allowed for 3 strikes, and because they succeeded with 3 strikes, have actually been made more powerful by their success. No accountability of the Department of Corrections to anyone, really. And the same is true with sheriffs. Each one is like a king or queen of their own castle. The huge number, if you look down the list, the huge number of legislators who are district attorneys or prosecutors, not a good thing. The closed decision-making process in the Massachusetts legislature, in which the Speaker and the Senate President have a huge amount of power. In March 2012, a report from the Center for Public Integrity gave Massachusetts D+ in legislative accountability. Not surprising, right? The overall public integrity grade was C. There are only 10 legislators in the Black and Latino caucus out of 200 total. And the majority of white legislators do not see progressive changes in criminal justice as central to them or to their constituency. Progressive, by and large, white organizations have not focused on mass incarceration. There is almost no philanthropic or foundation money for organizations working against mass incarceration. There is no statewide coalition for change. The few organizations that exist have no or one staff person and almost no membership. Communities hardest hit by mass incarceration are just that, hardest hit, making it hard to find the time, energy, and financial resources to organize against this. Many white people, I hear this all the time, many white people believe that Massachusetts is a progressive or liberal state when it comes, and which creates a culture of self-satisfaction. When they do hear what's happening, hopefully not in this instance, instead of thinking, what can I do to respond, they think, I know what's going on, and if things were really this bad, I would know about it. So they give themselves a pass. Massachusetts remains a deeply segregated state. Therefore, the concerns that impact and hurt African American and Latino communities are not known to most white people in a visceral way. So this is my list. We can discuss it, and I hope at the question and answer part, I have a big list of bills and things that people can do, and I hope that we can talk about some of that. Thank you.
Thank you, Lois. A lot to digest there. Our next speaker is going to be Chuck Turner. Chuck was born in Cincinnati in 1941, received a BA from Harvard in 1963, and settled permanently in Boston in 1966. Since then, he's been a vocal activist and organizer around issues of housing, minority employment, services for Boston's Black community, and land use policies. In 1999, he went from being a dynamic organizer to also being the elected representative of District 7 on the City Council, where he combined the two roles. He currently is a consultant for the Boston Workers Alliance. Throughout his long activist career, Chuck has not only been a fierce defender of the Black community, but also a reliable ally to and advocate for all who struggle for social justice. Whether the issue was LGBT rights, anti-war activities, the schools, immigrant rights, Chuck was always there. And we're very proud to have him on our panel to speak to the effects of mass incarceration on his community. Thank you.
I want to maybe deviate somewhat from the topic that you just announced in terms of the effect on the community. Let me start though by suggesting that everybody who hasn't read Michelle Alexander's book should read it. It's a must read. I think it's the best. It's the first book that I think presents the dilemma that we as African Americans have in this country in a very clear and comprehensive way. First book. Why? Because she points out that while maybe 13 years ago, when she was a lawyer, before she began to write the book, began to really understand what was going on, she accepted the whole premise that the criminal justice system was moving beyond its appropriate scope, but that it was within the parameters of the system, that it was just focused on criminal justice. As she looked at it more closely and gained more experience, what she realized is kind of what Carl was saying. This wasn't about that. It wasn't, the war on drugs wasn't about crime, and the system wasn't about criminal justice. It was a continuation of the 400-year strategy of mass incarceration of the African American. That's her premise. As a civil rights activist, civil rights lawyer, as a legal scholar, her premise is that the war on drugs was a consciously designed strategy to continue the 400-year incarceration of the African American. She points out that the first phase is the phase that we all look at, slavery. What she does is then goes on to focus on what the man who was in town recently, I forget his name, he was at the Church and Prison Conference, he wrote Slavery by Another Name. Blackman, read Slavery by Another Name. As companion books, you'll begin to get a sense of what is going on. Because she points out, as Blackman points out, that the end of the Civil War created a problem. You have these black men who are competing, and women, but are competing with white workers, and who are pulled out of the economic system in the way that they had been placed before in order to provide the economic engine for the wealth of the South. After 10 years, the troops were withdrawn. And that meant that the system could reintroduce itself. But slavery couldn't be introduced in the old way because there was the 13th Amendment. What they did was they created laws, the Black Code, many aspects. They had a number of features, but as Blackman pointed out, it was impossible not to be arrested. You had to have a job. You had to have a job. If you didn't have a job, you were a criminal and could be arrested for vagrancy. That also meant that the person who was hiring you for the job could pay you anything or not pay you anything, because they knew that you had no alternative except to work for them. And for those who were arrested, who couldn't be arrested for vagrancy, but were arrested for other things, they became the new slaves. The new slaves. Blackman pointed out that that their life was worse than the slave. Why? It was worse than the slave because there was no investment. They rented, they leased the labor of the convicts. They would go down to the jail and they would lease them for a year. That meant that you get as much labor as you can get from them. And if they aren't there at the end of the year, it doesn't matter. You have have in fact been able to get your value from that commodity. So we had slavery, and then we had convict labor system that lasted essentially for 80 to 100 years. And then there was and as part of that convict labor system, you had the Jim Crow laws that set up a separate society, that said that created a underclass, a grouping of people who were, through that process, identified as less than. As a grouping of people. That's what it meant. That to the poor whites, to the whites who were being economically abused, the owners, the bourgeoisie, the plantation people could always say, "You think? Hey, look at them. You know, you're really a step above them." As Michelle points out in the book, that historically, the way the whites in control have always used the relationship between blacks and working and whites, poor whites, as a way of maintaining both of them in a state of incarceration, economic incarceration for the whites. Mass incarceration of another nature for African Americans. What happens then? In the 60s, you have blacks coming into the cities. You have coming north at a time when the jobs, as you pointed out so well, were being shipped off, offshore, where the economic situation for the working, where the owners of capital made the decision that we can't afford to pay these white workers what they want anymore. They made the decision that they came to the conclusion that they couldn't afford to pay the white workers, and they shipped the jobs out of the country or into the South so that they would not have to pay the white workers. And then what did they do? They said to the white workers, the problem is affirmative action. You've really got these black men and black women who are coming after your jobs. That's really the problem. But that wasn't enough. That creates part of a framework of mental control. But then Nixon declared the war on drugs. Right? At the same time that the jobs are being sent overseas, that the whole focus on affirmative action, not as a restorative justice tool, but as a plot to take your jobs away from you, at a point where the white worker is in tension because of what is happening to them, Nixon says, let's declare a war on drugs. He wasn't able to move it forward because of his own criminality. He couldn't move it forward. But Reagan came in, read Michelle Alexander's book. She draws such a clear, precise picture of how they consciously instituted the war on drugs as a way of doing what? Taking black men off the streets. So the whole question of rebellion by these men and the children of these men who had come back 10 years earlier from the war, they pulled the population off the streets. And they were able to say to the white working class, we're standing up for justice. We are standing up for an end to crime. They were able to take the competition away and at the same time satisfy the feelings that the white working class had in terms of feeling that they were being abused by these people. But their politicians were standing up and they were going to deal with these people who were nothing but criminals. 500,000 people of all races in jail in 1980. 500,000 people of all races in jail in 1980. 2.3 million today. 500,000 in 1980. 2.3 million today. We talk about the whole question of invasion of privacy, of government moving to just intrude itself into our life. Read Michelle Alexander's description of how the war on drugs gave grants to the police departments, to better target their activities, how they ignored the Supreme Court and the courts ignored the question of the Fourth Amendment and the whole issue of search and seizure, how they just wiped it out. Why? Because they had black people that they were focusing on. You know, they wouldn't make it, they could get started with it with us, because if they did it with white people, they couldn't have gotten away with it. It's masterful. Her picture of how those who control this system use the war on drugs to reinforce their ability to keep a lock on the mentality of white workers and at the same time incarcerate the black males who could be a threat to the stability and the peace and quiet, not of the way they run their economy. And what do we have today? We have today a system where the oligarchy that runs this country takes more and more and more of the wealth, and the worker, the white worker, is becoming poorer and poorer and poorer. And what are those Southerners saying to those white workers in the South and the North? They are saying to them that it's a government that's in collusion with those blacks and those liberals. That's your problem, aren't they? Isn't that what happened? Aren't the rich becoming richer and richer and richer? And aren't they whipping up the emotional frenzy of the white workers who are becoming poorer and poorer and feel they're paying too much taxes, and they are saying no more taxes, which is really, when you think about it, crazy for workers, for a white declining middle class to be against food stamps. I mean, think about it. It is insane. It is insane. But that insanity is being consciously. Read Michelle Alexander's book. Seriously, when you look at how, because what she does is she just takes it step by step, and she takes every phase of it. Let me get to the key point, because the question, when you talk about the effect, the effect means that I spent 50 years working in Roxbury, in Greater Roxbury. The reality is that we're in danger of being driven out just by the way the system works. That is that we've held the land for 30 or 40 years. They have fought for public amenities, and that's created the groundwork for the real estate dealers and the developers to come in, and now apartments are being built that are renting for $1,700 a month, in the heart of the black community. The question is, what do we do, given the fact that the reality of the creation of this process of mass incarceration has in fact it made even worse the issues of poverty and unemployment in the community. What she says at the end is that don't think we can piecemeal our way out of this. Then there has to be an alliance between the white workers who are being squeezed to death and the black, Latino, Asian workers. There has to be a coming together of those groupings of people who are being pitted against each other so the rich can become richer and richer and richer. And unless we do that, she says, you're fooling yourselves. It's not going to change. So my perspective is you have to get rid of the war on drugs. You have to get rid of the war on drugs. If you look at her analysis, as long as the war on drugs stays there, it enables them to keep the system fully in place. Read her book. She lays it out systematically. As long as the war on drugs stays there, they are able to work the system because it's a system that they have developed. A system of mass incarceration with the prosecutors as king, with the police being subsidized by the federal government and being given armaments. The SWAT teams come in. The SWAT teams are organized to deal with drug raids. It's a system to maintain the mass incarceration of African Americans, Latinos, but now more and more whites. More and more white workers are being incarcerated. Why? Because their frustration is going up. Those who run the systems must be saying, look, we're taking more and more of the resources away, and so we need to have a system where we can take whites who begin to rebel out of it. That might seem like fear talk or rhetoric or radical rhetoric. Read Michelle Alexander's book. She puts it all there. Brothers and sisters, we're on the edge. We're in fascism. We are in the first stages of fascism. They've used the war on drugs to create a system of state power that people don't challenge. That people don't challenge, and it just goes on. And even in liberal Massachusetts, liberal Massachusetts, look, with a black governor put it in place. We're in trouble.
I'm going to give the panelists a couple of minutes to comment on each other's talks, or perhaps ask each other some questions, and then we'll get to questions from the audience.
I would just want to say that book that Chuck mentioned, Slavery by Another Name, is a fantastic other book. And I don't know whether anybody's ever seen it. I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but I mean, there's a movie version of it and a documentary, and it's great. It's a fantastic, and it really talks about this huge block of time that we need to see, because it is the block of time from the end of slavery to the complete institutionalization of Jim Crow, which is like 100 years. And you can't really understand what's going on without reading that book and understanding it. There's another really fantastic book that I always recommend, and it's called The Prison and the Gallows. And it talks about, and it's the history of creating a carceral state in the United States. It's by a woman named Marie Gottschalk, who I think was at Harvard or something yesterday. I saw something about it. Anyway, it's an amazing book. And it talks about how these different institutions were created, including policing and police and law enforcement, assistance administration, all of the things that put the kind of policing and carceral state that we have now. So it's another book that I recommend. And the one other thing, just in terms of what Chuck was saying, I mean, I don't know what's going on, I mean, what you're saying in Roxbury, but I mean, a similar kind of thing is happening in New York, in Harlem, that's being sort of, overtaken by, and rents going after, and people being pushed out, people who are African-American people that's been, who's their historic home being pushed out by white gentrification. And that's another thing that's happening. It sounds like a very similar kind of thing to what's happening in Roxbury. Maybe.
One of the things I think is, so there's all that, right? And what do we do? One of the things I think has a tendency to, in different types of organizing, different types of activism I've seen, is that we say, well, we need to get more people. We need to convince more people. I'll tell you, anything that's ever happened, for any change that's ever happened, any historical events, in the pre-United States, in the colonies, you know how many people supported the Revolutionary War? You know what percentage it was? Yeah, at different places, different times, it wasn't anywhere over 12% ever, right? Until then the colonists won, and then they said, okay, well, this is good. This is good now. So that doesn't happen, right? And right now, if you go, and I'll ask Chuck for backup on me, if you go right now in Roxbury and you just stop and you hold a sign that says against mass incarceration, right? You're not going to get a lot of argument from anybody. No one's going to say, well, what do you mean? What is that supposed to mean, right? When people were doing corridor reform, a lot of folks who were not normally in Roxbury, not normally in the black and brown parts of Dorchester, not normally in the Latino parts of Jamaica Plain, would go there and doing different, and they were so surprised that they didn't have to give the whole pitch of why corridor reform needed to happen, why all these things had to happen, because people are living that every day. Every black, and I'll just say it for black people because the statistic is very clear, and Latino people, because of the way we track Latino or Hispanic, the statistics are more difficult, so forgive me for that. But African Americans in this country, if you're between the ages of 17 and 35, 1 in 3 of those people, of men between those ages, jail, prison, probation, parole. So that means if you see a black person in this country and they have a family, which people have families, someone in their family is in jail, prison, probation, or parole. Almost a certainty that someone not like their third cousin, it's their mother, their child, their brother, their sister, someone immediately in their family. And they know it for real. They know what it means to be visited and searched by dogs. They know what it means to have a guard say something completely like piggish to you when you're getting strip searched in a little room to try to visit somebody. They know what it means to go in front of a judge and have a judge wagging their finger at you in this vile and thinly veiled racist way. So the thing by all that I'm saying is we have the troops. We have the people that could affect change. The thing that I think we don't have is the organization and the belief that we can change it. The organization and the belief that we can change it. When we have those two things, this thing's coming down. And that's what we need to do. And that's why I'm happy to see you.
So we'll take questions from the audience. Let's start with Marty.
Yeah, my name is Marty Rosenthal, and I'm Frank Farlow's other co-chair. Frank does all the work, and I occasionally show my face. But I want to get back to what Carl just said about organizations, and I can't resist giving a little of my own historical perspective on this for 35 years, because this all started not just with Nixon, but with liberals in the 70s. My first foray into this was Jack Becken and myself against Alan Dershowitz and Congressman Drinan on the subject of federal criminal code reform, which became the federal sentencing guidelines.
Marty, can you stand up just so the people in the back can hear you, please?
Put my laptop down. And that became the federal sentencing guidelines supported by Ted Kennedy in coalition with Strom Thurmond. And it was liberals that thought we needed more uniformity. And they gave in to that notion that there were sentencing disparities and we could create mandatory minimums and guidelines. So they became draconian and horrible, and it kept getting worse and worse. The first mandatory here was 75, right after I became a public defender. So then it keeps going and going and going in the 80s. Dukakis bought into it with presumptive sentencing. He was a wonderful governor in a lot of ways, but he bought into this. And Backman and I debated Rosenfeld, his legal counsel, and Senator Backrack from Watertown, who was another liberal. And that got defeated, but it still kept getting worse and worse and worse. What started happening in the 2000s was that the right-wing anti-tax mentality cut back on funding for this draconian prison population, and a lot of places, not yet Massachusetts, started cutting back. Even Newt Gingrich got onto smart on crime instead of tough on crime. But Massachusetts was slow. What happened a couple of years ago, it's 2010, a wonderful thing happened, and to me, it was just a burst of fresh air, because I've been doing this all these years, and it wasn't happening. There was finally a grassroots coalition, and a lot of it was directed at Corey reform. And that movement got an impetus for Corey reform, which got joined with some mandatory minimum reform at the State House. And Senator Cream of Brookline and Newton was very instrumental in keeping them together. And the Corey people got a wonderful momentum, and the only way to get it, because Cream held out to brinksmanship, was to do some mandatory minimum reform. That's the first time that happened, 2010. And then 2012, Governor Patrick, it wasn't his impetus on three strikes. It really came from Jerry Leone, the DAs, the Gasul family, and that's what I want to get to is there's been an imbalance all these years with DAs and so-called victims' rights advocates and politicians jumping on that bandwagon of these tough sentences. There's been almost nothing on the other side. The ACLU has increased a lot its work on criminal justice issues. I've seen it. I was a board member in the 80s, and it's developed a lot, and there's wonderful people involved now, and I tell Carol Rose that I'm very appreciative. But the point is, what that coalition for Corey reform made a big impact in 2012, because when three strikes got pushed by particularly the DAs, that coalition fought back against it. And I was at two wonderful meetings in Roxbury.
You have a question?
Yeah, a huge crowd, and I'm hoping that will expand, is what I'm asking about, is that group, that grassroots group, and a lot of them were in the inner city, and I'm hoping that will continue. I'd like to hear more about that movement and the developing influence groups on our side of this scale.
You know, there is a continuation of that movement. Epica from Worcester, a prisoners group of ex-prisoners and prisoners' rights advocates, and the VW Boston Workers Alliance are still working with other organizations around the Jobs Not Jail campaign. It's focused in April to have a major demonstration of April as part of a campaign to attack a number of the problem in the criminal justice system. The reality, though, see, I was arrested as a city councilor in 2002, demonstrating at sitting in at the health commission's office, because they were about to adopt the framework that the governor just
Romney.
That Well had put forward these regulations that essentially made it impossible, if you had a criminal record, to work with people who were in the system under state control. And there were a group of us that felt that this was that we couldn't allow it to go forward, and we demonstrated and brought a lot of attention. I think the movement really moved to a large extent off of that momentum. But the point I want to make is that it doesn't mean anything it doesn't mean anything, because if you go with me to Roxbury and Dorchester and Mattapan and Hyde Park, what you'll see is unemployment, people who are unemployed at the rates of 25, 30, 35, 40%. And all the things we can do around improving the marginalities of the criminal justice system is not going to change the economic realities of the mass, of the base of the mass incarceration. And that is that this system has created a continuation of 30 to 45% unemployment. If you have a record, you can't get into public housing. You know, the employers can say, we don't want you. You know, we don't need to give you any reason. You're a criminal. It has made the situation for African American men and women even more, the underclass even more intolerable. And so I'm not saying that the work, it isn't important to deal with these marginalities, but let's be frank, that there are 141,000 black people in Boston. The marginal changes are not going to end the fact that, from my perspective, 75,000 of that 141,000 are stuck in a system where we're waiting to be driven out by the economic forces. 50% of the people I represented couldn't pay the rent in the apartments during the last 10 years I was in office. 50%. They depended on government subsidies. The government is now cutting back on Section 8s. Understand, we're prisoners. We're prisoners. It's not, the people in prison are the tip of the iceberg. The prison is in Roxbury, it's in Harlem, it's in Springfield, it's in Fall River. Those are the prison. People are in prison. They're living. I told people I was in a prison, but I said to people around me, because I was in a work camp, I could go on the streets and I could recruit men to come in here and take my place. Because the life I'm living compared to the life they're living is 10 times better. 10 times better. See, the prison of America are on the streets of our urban areas. Those are the prisons. And that feeds the ability of the police to do what they do, because if you have 30 to 40% of the people who are unemployed, how do you stop crime? How do you get children to be serious about education? The children of the ones whose fathers or mothers are in prison, to be serious about themselves. America is a prison. The prison system is really the way they're taking the most dangerous of us off the street so they can maintain better control of the true prison of America.
And my question to all of you is, I listened tonight and I heard you speak of other states that have incorporated ways to decrease prisoners. And I know that throughout history, there have been strategies that shifted paradigms. So I was wondering, what movements and what strategies could we put in place or could be used to develop a plan to begin to change what's happening in Massachusetts?
I want to answer you. One thing I think is that Massachusetts is extremely insular. Massachusetts doesn't think that. Massachusetts can learn from anything that's happening in any other state. If that state is Kentucky, Massachusetts can't learn from Kentucky, right? Massachusetts can't learn from New York.
Okay, so
So there are things that are happening, but the people have to find out what's happening in those states.
yes.
People have to convince not just the legislators from Roxbury and Dorchester and whatever, but the legislators from Wellesley and whatever, I mean, the rest of the state, that it's important that they pay attention to what's happening and that they get their heads out of the sand and stop thinking that everything's so fantastic here.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is that in strategizing and developing this document, that we shift the attitudes, it may not be necessary to say this is Kentucky, or this is South Carolina, or North Carolina, or whatever. Just develop, like maybe.
But it doesn't have to be developed out of whole cloth. In other words, there are things that are happening in other places that can be models for what's happening here. If people are willing to look at other places.
Okay.
That's all I'm saying,
Okay.
I mean, like, we don't have to sit down and think, oh, we don't know anything, let's see what we can figure out. We could look, to the right and to the left and say, oh, these people.
I agree with you. I agree with you.
So, that's, I think, a start, a start for people here.
Thank you.
Question? Back there with the glasses, yes.
I'd like to make a very short comment and then ask a question of Carl in terms of the numbers of people that we need to affect change and where they come from. I didn't know anything about this until I read Michelle Alexander's book.
Speak up and louder, please.
I read Michelle Alexander's book last January and I saw Slavery by Another Name. I visited Lois in Northampton. I visited the Boston Workers Alliance. I did my little research. I found out that I've been living a privileged life for 72 years, unlike most of you in this room. But I decided I've got to do something. So I volunteer at Palmville Correctional Center on Saturday morning. I also volunteer with this organization called Jobs Not Jails. It's a coalition of organizations that did do the Corey reform and meet every week in the Boston Traveling Alliance to strategize about the April 26th event. We have a petition outside, Jobs Not Jails. We'd like you to sign that before you leave. No obligation there. But the real issue is to take that petition, take what you've learned tonight, incorporate it into your lives, and get your friends and community to sign that petition. My job is very simple.
Agreeing with you.
Oh, good. My job in this huge coalition is very small. Reach out to communities of faith. We have 11,000 plus signatures already. We have Baptists that are going to be organizing this. We have a group in Arlington for the Unitarians. 6 people reaching out to 140 Unitarian communities. I've been to 12 of these meetings like this. Most of them a little bit smaller, I must admit, but everybody gasped at the same fact that Lois presented beautifully today. I got to get Steve to get that speech up on the website. There is a website, jobsnotjails.org, where you can learn about this. The gasps are coming from white people who said, what? You mean we have a racial disparity here that's worse than the national average? It's 8-to-1 here. The national average is 6-to-1. They're astounded. And so it's a question of getting to them. Lois told me back in June, if you want to affect change here, you got to affect the legislature. And it's white. And they're going to listen to you if you come from Wellesley and Lexington and Weston and Brookline and Belmont. They're going to listen to you. How do we get to them? That's the question. Carl, how do we get to this wider audience, which is white? And number 2, do we need more than 5%? Can we survive with 5, or do we need to go to 15% of this population? Thanks.
I think what needs to happen is, I use military analogies in a lot of things and people get very upset about it. But one of the most important things that militaries talk about when they're launching campaigns, and they say, look, we need to go, whatever, invade this country, take this hill, occupy this land, is morale of troops. And morale of troops is based in people seeing victory, knowing what they're trying to do and seeing victories. I think a really good example, Lois was talking about looking to our right and to our left, and I think if we looked a little bit to our south, look at what people did in New York on stop and frisk, and heaven forbid for me to say something great about New York City. Massachusetts, but we can beat that. I actually just had a conversation with the director of Communities United for Police Reform today, and said, you know, look, you can come up here, but you can't talk on that Yankee stuff. I said, we want to do what you did. We want to do a lot of the work that you did, but we're going to do it better because we're Boston. So I think actually looking at Communities United for Police Reform, if people don't know about their work, about the Floyd case, they went into courts, although they just kind of got their asses kicked back a little bit because the system came back into and said, well, no, you're not going to do that. But it's still, the ball is still ahead of where it was when it started. They went in the courts, they went in the streets. They wanted that in City Hall, even though the governor, the mayor was like, we're not going to do that. They were like, oh yeah, yes you are. They wanted the State House, and they wanted in the mayoral election. It was an issue in the mayoral election. Right, it was an issue in the mayoral election, which is a victory in itself. Even if they're just talking about it, saying, well, what are you good about stop and frisk? No one was like, well, stop and frisk is a good thing. Which is where we would be in Massachusetts if you tried to inject that into either the mayoral elections here or gubernatorial elections. People would say, what do you mean stop and frisk? That's just what police do. That's stop and frisk, right? But New York, now it's a bad word, right? If I say stop and frisk, you go, that's a bad thing, right? That's a win, right? That means they won because now that's a bad thing. And we need to be able to do that. We need to ride on that here and do it one better. So some things that I think people could do, and it matters, some of these, people could do cop watch, right? People can go around. If you live in a, I think really getting out stories about what's going on. When the coalition started doing work in New York, a lot of the people, because they had grassroots organizations, they had the big, organizations with money, ACLU, it's becoming, CCR, Center for Constitutional Rights, and then people on the streets, and regular folks. And people started saying, hey, maybe I should videotape this encounter with the police. Maybe I should put this on. A young man was about 19 years old, was stopped 3 times in one day in frisk. He stopped 3 times in one day in frisk. To people in communities of color, that's not surprising. I'm a lawyer, I get stopped. I get put up against walls. I've had a cop go through my car and go through my pockets. And I said, you can't do any of this. I'm a lawyer, that happens to me. What do you think happens to a 17-year-old kid? His pants are hanging down, who isn't going to be as polite, who isn't going to have that same kind of interaction, and probably doesn't have, I can push back a little bit. But I think if we bring those stories out, that's the kind of thing that's going to change people's minds. That's the thing that's going to change people's hearts and say, you know what, maybe I can get down with this. Maybe I can understand this some more. So I think that, actually people writing to prisoners, as we said before, Jericho Movement has a list of political prisoners that have been in prison mostly for 20, 30, some 40 years. So you can go to their website. Black and Pink is an organization here that does, in Boston, that does regular writing to LGBTQ prisoners who are facing, you throw an African American or Latina who identifies as LGBTQ. There's just a whole extra set of fears and terror involved in isolation. So those folks getting cards and hearing and bringing out those stories. Another thing, the Massachusetts Bail Fund, for a plug for the Massachusetts Bail Fund, is folks who, a lot of these women want $50 bails, $100 bails. You can just, if you're giving them $100 to help them bail some folks out, it kind of keeps going because they bail someone out, the case gets resolved, they get the $100 back, they can bail someone else out again. So you want to work on some freedom, you give them $1,000, that's like 5 or 10 people out of people who are serving bail time. So those are just a few. But I think that stuff gets the ball rolling, and then we start to change. What we need to do is be on the upswing. For too long, we've been going down and down and down, meaningless. But I think if we start moving the ball ahead, if we start making small victories, people will join. People will start to get behind what's happening. Because that happened with court reform. A lot of people didn't know what court. But when I left for law school, if you said court to someone, there's no idea. Now, unless they had Corey, right? Well, people, privileged folks, if you say Corey, they didn't know Corey, right? Now, if you say Corey in Massachusetts, pretty much people know what that means, and they kind of go, ooh, Corey. Whatever it is, the state's doing something not good to you, right? And that's a battle that was won, because people started doing the work and started, people themselves started bringing those stories out. People who were affected by that started bringing those stories out. And Boston Workers' Lights, when I talk about organizing, I always use Boston Workers' Lights as an example, because they weren't like, hi, I'm a person of privilege and I will tell you a story. They were like, you're gonna be up there and you're gonna tell you a story. Right? And that's compelling to people. That's hard to ignore. Someone saying, look, I served, 9 months in jail and now I want to get a job at McDonald's and I can't get a job at McDonald's. But that's me ranting.
Okay, Chuck?
No.
Okay.
Let me, just a quick comment. When I was 17, I was fascinated by the fact that alcohol had been made illegal. A law, the Volstead Act, was passed, I think, in 1921 to make alcohol illegal. 1933, the Volstead Act was repealed. Why? Because they saw that the police corruption had reached an incredible level, because the violence that was happening around the whole situation was felt to be intolerable, because people's health was being destroyed by what was going on. A law was passed to make alcohol illegal, and 12 years later the people rose up and said, no, we would rather deal with the effects of alcohol than deal with the effects of prohibition. Why don't the people who organize this meeting look at the question of whether Brookline ought to start a movement here to talk to people about why we ought to end the war on drugs and the way the war on drugs has been used to hurt everybody. I think Michelle lays out the arguments about how the war on drugs is not just affecting the people who are incarcerated, it is affecting the entire society. If they could repeal the Volstead Act after 12 years, why can't we end the war on drugs after 80 to, you take 1980 to 2013, we've had 33 years of this craziness. I think it's time to end the war on drugs.
This young lady right here.
Wait, I'm
I'm sorry.
I have to make a pitch for this. I can't leave here without doing this because I'm totally obsessed with it, and so I have to say something about it. And that is this thing about there's flyers that look just like this out on that table. And it's about a new policy of the Department of Corrections, which is if you go to visit somebody, if you are anybody, 2 years old or 82 years old, when you are in the security trap, the place between the waiting area and where you get to visit, when you're being searched, they will have dogs sniffing you. And I found out about this in March when somebody told me they saw a videotape in the waiting room saying that they were going to start this, and I went ballistic. And I called everybody that I could think of to try to pressure the DOC to stop it. And what they did was they said they put it on hold. And then they came out, the first set of dogs that they showed on these videos were German Shepherds. And then when they re-released the video, they have this fluffy dog, not a German Shepherd, but a fluffy dog. And so it's supposed to be benign. And they said that they were going to start it up again in November now. And so I did the same thing. I called everybody, sent emails to everybody, had these things made up. And people started calling, and a lot of the people that were calling and are calling are people who have to go through this demeaning, degrading, disgusting procedure. Getting in to visit without the dogs is a demeaning, degrading, and disgusting procedure. This is on top of that. And the reason that I'm talking about this is, one, is that it's important that the phone numbers of the 3 people in charge are on this flyer. And I really hope that you take a flyer and everybody call them. Tomorrow it will take you 3 minutes. They're not going to talk to you, believe me. Although, because they got so many calls, they did call some of us back up. Andrea Cabral, the head of PEOPS, called me up to try to convince me why this was a good thing. Spencer called other people up. They had a big call list of people that they wanted to talk to about this. And they were going to try to convince us to do it. And then the other thing that happened is that Prisoners Legal Services decided that they would be part of a suit against the DOC, and the ACLU found a cooperating attorney to be part of a suit against the DOC, and that suit will be filed in Suffolk Superior Court next week, I think. But the thing that is important about this is that all of us, we probably get these emails, call so-and-so, call California about the hunger strike at Pelican Bay in California. You know, call about so-and-so in someplace, call about Herman Wallace, who, I knew, in Angola, in Louisiana. Well, people in Massachusetts need to start calling in Massachusetts. The DOC and EOPS, they were really, really surprised and pissed off that people were calling them. And there is a new jail, this new, quote, facility for awaiting trial women, KCON. They need to hear that that is not okay. We need to start communicating with them. And everybody can communicate with them. And so that to me is a strategy. We can communicate with them. And it's easy to communicate with them. You get their phone numbers and you call them up. Everybody's on the phone all the time. Use your phone to call them up. And start with calling them up about the dogs. And so please take a flyer when you go out.
Okay, right here, and this is the last question, I apologize, but we really have to look at the time. Yes.
I just want to say the question in regard to what can we do when we leave here. You know, there's a lot of formerly incarcerated people who are organized, and I would really recommend that as you try and figure out what you want to do, to align yourselves with formerly incarcerated people, because we know. And we are trying to get the assistance and the leverage that a lot of people in this room have. And so if you really want to help, but come to the people who know what things
Her comment, and that's Andrea James. She has just written a wonderful book called Upper Bunkies Unite, which is Sheila's holding up right there. It's a fantastic book. It's wonderful to read. $10. And I highly recommend it.
What's the name of the organization?
Our organization is an organization of formerly incarcerated women. We organize women and other supporters to stop prison building, particularly in Massachusetts, and to reverse the legislation and policies around mass incarceration. And we are Families for Justice as Healing. Our phone number is 617, and I can repeat this a million times, and I have a stack of cards, 905-2026. We work with all of these other groups that were mentioned here tonight, and APICA and Boston Workers Alliance and all of the groups, and we are a coalition trying to make change. And we are right now organizing 10,000 formerly incarcerated women on the Washington Mall in June of 2014 to tell President Obama to commute the sentences of women in the federal system serving drug offenses. So, and working on a number of pieces of legislation right now in Massachusetts to create alternatives to incarceration, and if all of you voted for it, we would pass it. So that's the kind of help that we need. There are very specific, concrete things that are going on.
Andrea, what's the name of that other coalition you're a member of? What's the name of that one?
Excuse me?
The other.
Families for Justice is Healing.
Yes, but the other coalition you're on the steering committee for.
Jobs Not Ethical.
There, Jobs Not Jail. I'm sorry.
Right, we have a very specific ask, though, in addition to working with Jobs Not Jails, to move that $550 million over to community wellness alternatives. It is something we are working on to stop right now any further spending of the money that Lois laid out for you very specifically. This is not a dream, this is building brick by brick as we are sitting in this room. We need to come together, demand that they stop spending another penny of that $550 million and reallocate it to the programs that we are asking for. These are very specific things while we are talking about jobs like this.
So, I think we're at the end of the question period, but before people leave, I just wanted to say, as has been pointed out, Michelle Alexander notes that the movement against mass incarceration is the civil rights movement of our age. And further, I think, as was pointed out, the relationship between the movement against mass incarceration and the movement for economic equality, which is so central to making any progress in this country, is intimate. That if we're going to make any progress, we have to link those two and really address this issue. There are no easy solutions, but there are many avenues where we can begin to address at least some aspects. The speakers have pointed out a lot. We have a lot of information on the table outside. Please stop by on your way out. We have information on how to get in touch with the speakers' organizations and many others. Also, importantly, if you'd like to work with a new working group for Mass Occupy Brookline that's forming around this issue, please talk to me or to someone at our table after the event on your way out, and we will be in touch with you about this. We're particularly happy to announce two different projects which might be of particular interest to people. The People's Cafe, which is something that Mass Occupy Brookline puts on a somewhat regular basis under the banner, Great Music, Great Food for a Great Cause. We'll be doing a benefit for the Real Cost of Prisons Project and the Boston Workers Alliance on November 23rd at First Parish Unitarian Church on Walnut Street. The featured musician will be a Boston-based jazz pianist, Josh Rosen, who, in addition to performing, teaches at the Berklee College of Music. Food and drink will be served. There's no admission charge, but bring your checkbooks. No speech making, but we will do a collection. Second, at 7 o'clock. There are flyers for the event are on the table outside. Pick one up on your way out. The prison book program, which is based in Quincy, sends books to prisoners throughout the country. They've provided many thousands of books over the years and always need donations of paperback books, cash.
Just give us 1 minute, please. Please, your attention, just for 1 more minute, please.
I can personally attest to the importance of receiving books for people who are in prison. We have literature on the table about it, or see Chris McCardle, who will be at the table. There's also a great deal of other literature, as well as a sign-up sheet for future activities from Mass Occupy Brookline, and a chance to buy Michelle Alexander's book.